Hey everyone, today we are looking into the life of Eleonore von Schwarzenberg, a Bohemian noble who lived a comfortable life, though her later years were characterised by illness. Owing to this, rumours began to spread of a legend that the princess had become a vampire. But how concrete were these claims, and why in recent years has she become notorious for this sinister theory about her life? But before we jump into her story, I want to give a big thanks to June's Journey for sponsoring this video. For as long as I can remember, I've always been interested in history, just like many of you, but I'm also interested in mysteries and unknown things, just like today's case. And if you're interested in this, then June's Journey is right up your alley. June's Journey is a free-to-download game set in the 1920s where you have to look for clues and objects in a series of different scenes which are really spectacular. Using what you found, you try and piece together who murdered June's sister. During the game, you play as June going through all the twists and turns of the case, and you even have a little mansion that you can expand as you progress in the game. I've been enjoying June's Journey for a while now, and it's just a nice way to de-stress after a long day, and it's also satisfying when you find clues that bring you just a little bit closer to what actually happened. And although I still have quite a lot of clues and mysteries left to uncover, I'd highly recommend it, and I'm sure you'd love it. Make sure to click the link in the description and download June's Journey for free so you can start playing too. The woman who would one day become Eleonore von Schwarzenberg was born as Eleanor Elizabeth Amalia Magdalena on the 20th of June 1682 in the town of Melnik, in the region which was then known as Bohemia, but which today encapsulates the Czech Republic. Eleanor's father was Prince Ferdinand August of the House of Lobkowitz, a noble family of the region which could trace its roots back to the 14th century and which was accordingly one of the oldest and most respected aristocratic lineages in 17th and 18th century Bohemia. Ferdinand was also the second Duke of Sagan, his father, Václav Eusebius, having purchased this title and estate in 1646. Eleanor's early life is relatively unremarkable, and there is little documentary evidence concerning it. We can assume that she would have received a typical education for an aristocratic woman in the late 17th century, with an emphasis on dancing and court etiquette, while she would most likely have learned some Latin and almost certainly French, which was becoming the lingua franca of the aristocratic courts of Europe by this time. On the 7th of December 1701, when she was 19 years of age, Eleanor was married to Adam Franz Karl Eusebius, at the time the heir apparent to the princedom of Schwarzenberg, a major principality within the Archduchy of Austria. This was a major aristocratic title in Bohemia. Well, the Schwarzenberg title stretched back to the High Middle Ages, and Adam would eventually succeed as the Prince of Schwarzenberg in 1703. His marriage to Eleanor, as with so many other aristocratic unions of the early modern period, was effectively a financial transaction and alliance. In such arrangements, the bride's father would typically provide a large dowry to the groom's father. Hence, one side would gain financially, but the bride's family would usually marry upwards in social status if a substantial enough dowry could be provided. This was certainly the case with Eleanor, who, although coming from an aristocratic family, was marrying into a more prestigious one. In return, Adam's father, Prince Ferdinand Wilhelm, was to receive a dowry of 20,000 guilders or gold coins, a huge sum. 3,000 guilders were to be paid up front, with the rest due in installments in the years to come. Eleanor and Adam's marriage was fraught with difficulties from its very inception. When the union was negotiated between their respective fathers, Adam had been in a relationship with the daughter of the Austrian ambassador to Rome, whom he had married in secret. In order to facilitate the marriage to Eleanor, Adam had been forced to quickly annul this secret marriage. This poisoned the relationship between Eleanor and her new husband right from the beginning. Also, things would not improve. Well, Eleanor did not become pregnant in the months, and indeed years that followed. When a child did come, it was a girl named Maria Anna, who arrived into the world in December 1706. Yet, no male heir to preserve the direct line of the Prince of Schwarzenberg appeared. As if these issues were not bad enough, the relationship between Eleanor and Adam was further complicated when Eleanor's father married Adam's sister, Maria Elizabeth. With this, Eleanor's father also became her brother-in-law, an unsettling arrangement. Moreover, friction arose after this as Ferdinand was failing to meet his dowry payments to Adam. On top of that, Eleanor miscarried during another pregnancy in 1709, and then accusations of infidelity arose against her. As a result of all of this, the couple spent much of the 1710s estranged from each other and living in separate residences. But reconciliation was eventually brought about in 1719. That year, Adam inherited an enormous estate in Bohemia following the death of his aunt. With this, the arguments over Eleanor's dowry suddenly became largely redundant, and the tensions between Adam and Eleanor's father had already ended when Ferdinand died in 1715. Then, in 1722, the elusive male heir Joseph Adam was born. Hence, after over 20 years of fractured and unhappy marriage, Adam and Eleanor's union finally seemed to be settling down. Life with the von Schwarzenbergs was relatively peaceful and uneventful during the 1720s as they raised their young son. Throughout the 1720s, Adam had risen in the ranks of the Bohemian nobility, finding favour with the Archduke of Austria and Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI, who also ruled as King of Bohemia with the regnal title of Charles II there. Under Charles, Adam had already been made Chamberlain of the Geheimrat, effectively Charles's advisory council or the government cabinet in the 1710s. Then in 1722, he was appointed to a senior position within the royal household in Vienna. Therefore, Adam and Eleanor spent much of their time during the 1720s at the imperial capital in Austria. Finally, Adam was made a member of the Order of the Golden Fleece, the senior chivalric order within the lands of the Archduchy of Austria. Given his senior position within the Austrian territories, it is hardly surprising to find that Adam was a regular hunting companion of Charles's, but it is altogether more surprising that this pastime cost Adam his life. On the 10th of June 1732, Adam joined Charles on a hunting trip at Brandeis, near Prague. It would prove to be a fateful decision. Later that day, Charles, who suffered from poor vision, shot Adam after mistaking him for a deer, though other accounts claimed he just happened to be in the line of fire. Adam died the following day from his wounds. Following his death, Archduke Charles, no doubt riven by guilt at having killed his longtime friend and advisor, took Eleanor's son Joseph under his wing, and bestowed a large pension on Eleanor. Thereafter, she spent her remaining years managing the von Schwarzenberg estate. Sadly for the princess, in the late 1730s her health began to rapidly deteriorate. At the time, it is said that she became extremely skinny and weak, and as medical interventions were still very primitive, Eleanor turned to folk remedies to try and cure her ailments. These included the use of narwhal horn, the tusk of an Arctic whale, which was referred to as a unicorn horn in early modern Europe, and which was more valuable than gold by weight, owing to belief in its medicinal properties. Though we now know that the use of narwhal horn would not have been in any way beneficial in curing her condition. During this time, her condition continued to worsen, hardly being able to eat, drink or sleep, only resting at certain times during the day. Also, claims surrounding her life state that she was extremely pale and because of her illness began to employ various witches, alchemists and others with strange appearances in hopes that she could improve. Because of this, as well as the fact that Charles had accidentally killed her husband, he decided to send Eleanor one of his best doctors. The doctor eventually arrived at the Schwarzenberg estate, apparently claiming that she looked like a walking corpse, and that her room was constantly shaded as sunlight disturbed her. It was subsequently claimed that Eleanor also kept caged wolves in the basement of her estate, as she had spent years drinking their milk to improve her fertility, though it seems that these rumours are unfounded. With the passage of time, Eleanor continued to worsen and was in immense pain. Apparently, her screams became a fairly frequent occurrence at her palace, terrifying all who heard them. Finally, after years of suffering, she eventually died at the Palais Schwarzenberg in Vienna on the 5th of May 1741 at the age of 58. Following her death, an autopsy was performed and it confirmed that she has what we now know as cervical cancer. She was also suffering from several tumours, one of which was larger than a tennis ball. Before she died, she asked that her heart be buried next to her husband, while her body was buried in the church of St. Vitus Český Krumlov in the Czech Republic. At the time, fear of vampires was very much a real thing, so much so that local townspeople began disinterring the bodies of the recently deceased, chopping off their heads, afraid that they may be vampires. Meanwhile, some had stakes driven through them and others were burnt. Legend has it that some locals were convinced that the princess had become a vampire and that she was seen walking through the nearby towns and cemeteries after her death, while other more far-fetched tales claim that she was seen biting the corpses of the recently deceased, sucking out their blood. For years after this, stories of vampires continued to circulate in the region, and supposedly, for some time her name was considered damned, but eventually, these tales faded into myth, and these rumours were forgotten. Yet, due to the strange circumstances surrounding the end of her life, as well as Eleanor's medical history, it may be possible that some townsfolk actually believed her to be a vampire, or in some way related to the occult. Yet there is little concrete evidence from the time to confirm this. The legends surrounding her life are many, and it can be hard to separate the fact from the fiction. But despite this, in recent years she has been labelled as a vampire princess. But why? In 2007, Eleanor was the subject of a major investigative documentary which premiered on Austrian television entitled Die Vampir Prinzessin, or The Vampire Princess in English. This documentary speculated that Eleanor had engaged in vampirism and was the inspiration for Dracula, the great Gothic horror novel written by the Irish Victorian novelist Bram Stoker and published in 1897. The belief that Eleanor might have been the basis for Bram Stoker's magnum opus certainly has some arguments in its favour. For example, Dracula once had an alternative first chapter to that which was eventually published in 1897. This earlier draft version indicates that Stoker was actually inspired not by a man, but a woman. Moreover, this woman was a princess of the Austrian state, and references in the manuscript version refer to the region in the modern-day Czech Republic, where Eleanor would have lived in the first half of the 18th century. In addition to this, it was claimed that Eleanor had earlier been the inspiration for a poem entitled Lenore, written in 1773 and published the following year by the German author Gottfried August Berger. This was a Gothic ballad which, while not really featuring a typical vampire, had elements of vampirism in it, and is seen as having been a major early influence in the development of vampire literature. The poem is set in Bohemia, around the von Schwarzenberg estate, and the titling of Berger's poem as Lenore, an abbreviated version of Eleanor, led the documentarians in 2007 to claim that Eleanor had been the basis for Berger's work in addition to Bram Stoker's over 100 years later. Yet, these attributions are quite circumstantial, as was the other evidence presented in the documentary The Vampire Princess. For instance, it was claimed that the folk remedies Eleanor utilised to try and cure her ailments were indicative of a form of occultism. But in pre-modern times, such folk remedies were very widely used throughout Europe. But perhaps the most interesting piece of evidence presented by the documentarians to assert that Eleanor had dabbled in vampirism and had consequently been the inspiration for both Berger's and Stoker's works, concerned the von Schwarzenberg's family crypt in the town of Český Krumlov in the south of Bohemia. Here, both Eleanor and her husband Adam had been buried in the church of St. Vitus, but Eleanor's heart was removed and placed in an urn, which was then interred in a small cellar on the left side of the chapel next to Adam's heart. Today, a plaque over the cellar reads, "Here are stored the hearts of Adam and his wife Eleonora, princes of Schwarzenberg and dukes of Krumlov." By modern sensibilities, this is perhaps a strange case. Modern funerary and burial traditions do not generally have people removing the hearts of the deceased and interring them separate to their bodies, and the makers of Die Vampir Prinzessin were very anxious to stress that this was indicative of some form of occultism on Eleanor's part. Yet, by the standards of 18th century Central Europe, there was nothing too uncommon about this. Indeed, the royal family, the Habsburgs of Austria, had a similar tomb constructed in Vienna, in which the hearts of senior members of the family were interred separate to their bodies. As such, there is little concrete evidence to corroborate the argument that Princess Eleanore von Schwarzenberg was someone who engaged in vampirism and was accordingly the inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula. Thus, the legends regarding her life, referring to Eleanor as a vampire princess, despite being fascinating, are likely nothing more than that, legends. Thank you so much for watching this video on Eleanore von Schwarzenberg. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, be sure to leave me a like and a comment down below. And if you're new, why not subscribe? If you have any suggestions, please leave them in the comments, or you can send them to my email and my Instagram, which are both in the description. And make sure to have notifications turned on so you get all my videos as soon as they are uploaded. That's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.